June 19, 1944, 10:23 in the morning, somewhere west of the Mariana Islands in the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Mitscher is standing on the flag bridge of the carrier USS Lexington, wearing the battered lobsterman's cap he never takes off, staring at the radar plot. His chief of staff, Captain Arleigh Burke, is beside him. Neither man is speaking. They do not need to. The radar screen is telling them everything. A mass of contacts, hundreds of them, is closing from the west at roughly 180 knots. Japanese carrier aircraft. The largest strike force the Imperial Japanese Navy has launched since Pearl Harbor, and it is heading directly for the 15 American carriers of Task Force 58. Burke had been awake most of the night. The evening before, on June 18th, he had urged Mitscher to request permission from Admiral Raymond Spruance to turn the fleet west and launch a dawn strike against the Japanese carriers before they could launch. Spruance refused. His primary mission was to protect the invasion force landing on Saipan, and he would not risk an end run around his flank. Burke's assessment of the consequences was grim. He knew they could not reach the Japanese fleet. He knew the Japanese could reach them, and he knew what that meant for the morning. Now it is morning, and the Japanese are coming. Mitscher turns to Burke and says 5 words. Get those fighters up. Within minutes, every Hellcat fighter on every American carrier is in the air, stacking in layers at altitude, climbing to meet the incoming wave. The dive bombers and torpedo planes are launched too, but not to attack. They are sent east, away from the battle, to orbit over empty ocean. Mitscher is clearing his flight decks. He is making room for the fighters to land, rearm, refuel, and launch again. He is turning 15 aircraft carriers into 15 floating fighter bases. And then the first wave arrives. What happens over the next 8 hours will become one of the most lopsided aerial engagements in the history of warfare. By the time the sun sets that evening, the Imperial Japanese Navy will have lost more than 350 aircraft in a single day, the largest one-day destruction of enemy planes recorded anywhere up to that point in the war. The Americans will lose fewer than 24 fighters in air-to-air combat. A pilot aboard Lexington, often identified as a young lieutenant named Zygel Neff of Fighter Squadron 16, will land after the first engagements, climb out of his cockpit, and tell the men on the flight deck that the whole thing reminded him of shooting turkeys back home. The name will stick. History will call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But here is the thing about that name. It makes the battle sound simple. It makes it sound like the Americans showed up with better planes and more pilots, and the outcome was inevitable. It was not. The Japanese air crews who launched from those 9 carriers that morning were not amateurs by choice. Many of them were young men who had volunteered for the most demanding aviation program in the world, a program that had once produced the finest naval aviators on Earth. They had been told by their commanders that this was the decisive battle, the one their entire navy had spent 40 years preparing for. They believed they were about to win the war. And to understand why they believed that, and to understand what had actually been done to them before a single bullet was fired that morning, we need to go back. Not to 1944, not even to Midway in 1942. We need to go back to an afternoon in 1905, in a strait between Korea and Japan, where a Russian fleet sailed into a trap, and the entire strategic philosophy of the Imperial Japanese Navy was born in the smoke of a single battle. This is the story of how the most elite pilot corps in the Pacific was hollowed out from the inside by the very doctrine that created it, and of how, on a clear June morning west of the Marianas, the men who had been raised to believe they were invincible discovered that they had been sent to die by a system that had already consumed everything that once made them dangerous. We begin with a sentence that should sound like a contradiction. The Japanese naval aviators who were slaughtered in the Philippine Sea in 1944 were the direct descendants of the most successful carrier pilots in history. May 27, 1905. The Strait of Tsushima, between Japan and Korea. Admiral Togo Heihachiro, commanding the Japanese combined fleet, intercepted the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed 18,000 miles around the world to reach the Pacific. In roughly 24 hours, Togo destroyed it. He sank 21 Russian ships. He captured 7 more. Over 4,000 Russian sailors died. Japanese losses were 3 torpedo boats. It was, proportionally, one of the most complete naval victories ever achieved, and it broke something inside the Japanese Navy's mind. Not in a bad way, not at first. It gave the Imperial Japanese Navy a belief, a strategic certainty that would guide every major decision it made for the next 40 years. The belief was called kantai kessen, fleet decisive battle. The idea was simple. Japan was a smaller nation. It could not match the industrial production of its most likely enemy, the United States. But it did not need to, because wars at sea, as the American theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan had written and as Tsushima had proven, were decided by one great clash between the main battle fleets. Whoever won that clash won the war. Therefore, Japan did not need the most ships. Japan needed the best ships, the best trained crews, and the discipline to hold them back until the single moment of maximum advantage, and then to strike with everything at once. This idea shaped the construction of every major warship Japan built, from the super battleships Yamato and Musashi to the carrier Taiho, the most heavily armored aircraft carrier in the world. It shaped the way Japan trained its sailors, and it shaped, with consequences that would prove catastrophic, the way Japan trained its pilots. Because if the war was going to be decided in one battle, then every pilot had to be perfect, not good enough, perfect. And perfection required a selection process so brutal that it became a kind of institutional cruelty. Before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy accepted fewer than 100 trainees per year into its elite pilot program. The washout rate was staggering. Physical standards were extreme. A candidate had to be able to see in near darkness. He had to be able to hang from a bar for an extraordinary length of time. He had to endure spinning, disorientation, and stress tests that were designed not to find the capable, but to eliminate everyone except the exceptional. The men who survived this process received roughly 700 hours of flight training. They flew until their instructors could find nothing left to correct. They practiced gunnery until they could put a burst into a target the size of a man at 300 meters while pulling a high-speed turn. They practiced formation flying until a flight of 9 planes moved like a single organism. By 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had approximately 6,000 trained aviators. Roughly 900 of them were considered elite, the core of the carrier strike groups. These men were among the finest combat pilots on the planet. They were certainly, in the early months of the war, better trained than anything the United States Navy could put in the air against them. And on December 7, 1941, the world found out exactly how good they were. The attack on Pearl Harbor was, from a pure aviation standpoint, one of the most precisely executed carrier strikes ever attempted. 353 Japanese aircraft, launched from 6 carriers, flew over 200 miles, arrived over their targets within seconds of the planned time, and devastated the American Pacific Fleet in under 2 hours. They sank or badly damaged 8 battleships, destroyed 188 American aircraft on the ground, and killed over 2,400 men. Japanese losses were 29 aircraft and 55 aircrew. That is a kill ratio that military historians still study. And Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. In the months that followed, Japanese naval aviators tore through the Pacific with a ferocity that stunned every Allied force they encountered. They sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse off Malaya, struck by land-based bombers flying from bases in French Indochina, the first capital ships in history destroyed by air attack while underway at sea. They struck Darwin in northern Australia. They raided the Indian Ocean and sank the British carrier Hermes, the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, and a destroyer, all in a matter of days. The aircraft they flew, the Mitsubishi A6M0, was for the first 18 months of the war the most dangerous fighter in the Pacific. It could outclimb, outturn, and outrange anything the Americans or British could put against it. Allied pilots who tried to dogfight a Zero on its own terms died. The aviators who carried out these strikes were the products of the pre-war training system, the men selected from thousands, trained for years, refined through relentless practice. They were what kantai kessen had been designed to produce, and they were irreplaceable. That word, irreplaceable, is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Hold on to it, because what happened next, across the 30 months between Pearl Harbor and the Philippine Sea, was a slow-motion catastrophe that unfolded in a way no Japanese admiral wanted to see, and no Japanese institution was built to stop. The men who attacked Pearl Harbor, the 600 and the 900, the finest pilots in the Pacific, were not brought home after their triumph. They were not rotated into training commands to pass their skills to the next generation. They were kept at the front. They flew the next mission, and the next, and the next. Because the doctrine said the decisive battle had not yet come, and until it came, every pilot was needed on the line. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the Japanese lost roughly 90 aircraft and their crews, including many of the aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor just 5 months earlier. At Midway a month later, 4 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sunk, and with them went the majority of their air groups, nearly 250 aircraft, and most of their best aviators. The 55 aircrew killed at Pearl Harbor alone had already represented a significant portion of the annual peacetime training output. Midway was exponentially worse, but what followed was worse still. The grinding air campaign over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, from August 1942 through February 1943, consumed Japanese pilots at a rate the training system could not match. Japanese bombers and fighters flying from Rabaul to attack Henderson Field and the American fleet in the waters around Guadalcanal had to cross 600 miles of open ocean each way. The flights alone were exhausting. The combat at the end of them was lethal. Pilots who survived the fight often did not survive the flight home, ditching into the sea when their fuel ran out or their damaged engines failed. The battles over Rabaul in late 1943, when American carrier task forces struck the Great Japanese base directly, were even more destructive. American fighters, now flying the powerful F-4U Corsair and the new F-6F Hellcat, tore through Japanese formations with increasing confidence. The carrier air groups that had been painstakingly rebuilt after Midway were shredded again. By the time the remnants were pulled back to rebuild in early 1944, the original cadre, the Pearl Harbor veterans, the 700-hour masters, were almost entirely gone. Dead. Not retired. Not reassigned to train new pilots. Dead. And here is where the system revealed its fatal flaw. The pre-war training pipeline that had produced those extraordinary aviators was designed to produce quality, not quantity. It selected fewer than 100 men a year. It trained them for years. It could not be scaled up quickly because the entire philosophy was built on the idea that only the exceptional were worth training. When Japan tried to expand the pipeline after Midway, it discovered that it had no experienced instructors to staff the new training schools because the experienced pilots were all still at the front, or dead. The fuel was running short because American submarines were sinking Japanese oil tankers at a devastating rate. 21 tankers in the first 5 months of 1944 alone. Without fuel, the training planes could not fly, and without hours in the air, the new pilots could not learn. The numbers tell the story more plainly than any analysis. At the start of the war, the average Japanese Navy pilot had accumulated roughly 700 hours of flight time. By January of 1945, a new Japanese Navy graduate had approximately 40 hours. His American counterpart, flying off those 15 carriers west of the Marianas, had a minimum of 525. That is not a gap. That is an abyss. The Americans had built their system differently, and the difference was not one of wealth, although wealth mattered. The difference was philosophical. After the early carrier battles of 1942, the United States Navy made a decision that the Japanese Navy did not. The Americans pulled their best surviving pilots out of combat and sent them home. Not as a reward, as a strategy. Men like Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, the man who had invented the defensive weaving tactic that neutralized the Zero's maneuverability, was taken off the front line after Midway and assigned to train new pilots and develop new tactics. He was too valuable as a teacher to risk as a fighter. The Japanese did the opposite. Their best men stayed on the line because the doctrine demanded it. The decisive battle was always one engagement away, and every ace was needed for that single climactic clash that kept receding into the future. The American training pipeline was a vast, organized machine. Pre-flight schools at places like Athens, Georgia, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Iowa City, and St. Mary's in California fed cadets into primary and intermediate flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida, known as the Annapolis of the Air, and at Corpus Christi, Texas. Cadets flew basic trainers, then advanced trainers, then operational combat types. They practiced gunnery, navigation, formation flying, carrier landings, and instrument flight. They did it for months, accumulating hours in the air that their Japanese counterparts could only dream of by 1944. The Navy drew from an estimated pool of 500,000 men with pilot aptitude and produced roughly 61,000 naval aviators over the course of the war, more than 2.5 times the Japanese output. The result was that by 1944, the American training pipeline was producing thousands of pilots a year, each with 500 or more hours of flight time, each taught by veterans who had fought at Midway, at Guadalcanal, at the Eastern Solomons. The Japanese pipeline was expanding too, rushing thousands of new pilots through shortened courses, but they were graduating into cockpits with as few as 40 hours, some with even fewer, having been taught by instructors who had never seen combat because the men who had seen combat were already buried in the Pacific. There was a man who saw this clearly, and he said it out loud, though no one in command listened. His name was Saburo Sakai, and by 1944, he was the most famous fighter ace in the Japanese Navy. Official Japanese records credited him with 28 victories, though post-war historians have debated the exact total. He had survived being badly wounded over Guadalcanal in August 1942, losing the sight in his right eye. He was sent back to Japan and assigned to train replacement pilots, and what he saw in those training classrooms horrified him. In a 1998 interview, recounted by the interviewer from memory, Sakai described the promotion system in the Navy as being based on what school you graduated from and who you knew, not on merit, and said these were the kinds of leaders who were now making decisions about how to prepare young men for combat. About the replacement pilots themselves, Sakai was even more direct. He said that sending a pilot with only 20 hours of flight time against American Hellcats and Corsairs was itself a suicidal tactic, that there was no functional difference between that and a kamikaze mission. Nobody at headquarters wanted to hear it. By the spring of 1944, the Japanese Navy knew that the Americans were coming for the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The Marianas were critical. If the Americans took them, they would be within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. This was the decisive battle. This, at last, was kantai kessen. On March 1, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy organized nearly its entire remaining combat fleet into the first mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. Ozawa was a thoughtful, capable officer, one of the few Japanese admirals who genuinely understood carrier warfare. He had studied the American way of fighting, he knew what he was up against, and he had a plan. His fleet was organized around 9 carriers in 3 divisions. The first carrier division, under Ozawa himself, contained the fleet's strongest ships, the brand-new armored carrier Taiho, commissioned barely 3 months earlier, along with the veteran carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, both survivors of the Pearl Harbor attack. The second carrier division under Rear Admiral Takagi Joshima had the carriers Junyo, Hiyo, and the converted light carrier Ryuho. The third division, serving as a vanguard alongside the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, carried the light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. The air groups aboard these carriers, the 601st, 652nd, and 653rd Naval Air Groups, were, in the careful language of the official American assessment, largely green organizations. The 601st had been shattered in the air battles over Rabaul in November 1943 and had only been reconstituted in February 1944, barely 4 months before the battle. The plan was called Operation Aigo, and on paper, it was not unreasonable. Ozawa's carriers could launch strikes at roughly 300 miles, well outside the range of American carrier aircraft, which had an effective strike radius of about 200 miles. This meant Ozawa could hit the Americans while staying beyond their reach. His aircraft could strike the American fleet, then fly on past it to land and refuel at Japanese airfields on Guam, Tinian and Rota, rearm, and attack the Americans again on the flight back. Shuttle bombing, he called it. Additionally, he expected roughly 300 land-based aircraft already in the Marianas to soften up the American carriers before his own planes arrived. The arithmetic, if those land-based planes existed and his pilots could hit what they were aiming at, was not hopeless. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, captured the stakes in a single sentence when he activated the operation. He said the fate of the empire rests on this one battle. What Ozawa did not know, and what no one told him, was that his plan was already dead before it began. The first blow came from beneath. On March 31, 1944, Admiral Minachi Koga, the previous commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had been killed when his plane crashed in a typhoon. Worse, the plane carrying his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Fukudome, had crashed off the island of Cebu in the Philippines. Filipino guerrillas recovered Fukudome's briefcase, which contained the detailed operational plan, the Z plan, for the defense of the inner perimeter, including the broad outlines of what would become Operation Aigo. The briefcase was passed to American intelligence. The Americans knew the shape of the Japanese plan before Ozawa ever left port. The second blow came from the air. Starting on June 11th, 8 days before the battle, Mitscher launched a series of preemptive strikes against the airfields in the Marianas. 208 Hellcats swept over Guam, Tinian, Saipan and Rota. By the time they were done, roughly 200 of the 300 land-based aircraft Ozawa was counting on had been destroyed on the ground or shot out of the sky. One of the most critical legs of Ozawa's plan, the land-based air support, had been cut off before the fleet engagement even started. But Ozawa was not told. The commander of those land-based forces, Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, sitting on Tinian and watching his airfields burn, failed to report the true extent of his losses. Whether this was shame, confusion, or a refusal to deliver bad news up the chain, the result was the same. Ozawa sailed west, believing he had 300 planes waiting for him in the Marianas. He had almost none. So on the morning of June 19th, when Ozawa's 9 carriers began launching aircraft into the clear sky west of the Marianas, the strike force that climbed into formation and turned east toward the American fleet was not what it appeared to be. It appeared to be the massed air power of the Imperial Japanese Navy, roughly 430 carrier aircraft organized in 4 waves, supported by land-based air, flown by pilots of the nation that had destroyed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. In reality, it was a shell. The planes were real. Some of them were even good. The D-4Y Judy dive bomber was fast and modern. But the men inside those cockpits were, in the majority, barely trained replacements flying into the most sophisticated air defense system ever assembled, against pilots with 10 times their experience, in aircraft specifically designed to kill them. The day had already started badly for Japan before the carrier raids even began. At dawn, Japanese aircraft on Guam attempted to launch from Orote Field. 30 Hellcats from the light carrier Belleau Wood dove on them. In the swirling fight over the airfield, 35 Japanese planes were shot down for the loss of a single Hellcat. That ratio, 35-1, would set the pattern for the entire day. At 9:57, with radar showing large formations approaching from the west, Mitscher told Burke to recall the fighters from Guam. The radio call that went out was a circus term, an old American expression. It simply said, "Hey Rube." Every pilot knew what it meant. Get back here. Now. What was waiting for them was something no Japanese planner had fully accounted for, because the American fleet of June 1944 was a fundamentally different instrument of war from the one Japan had been studying since Pearl Harbor. Start with the fighter. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat had been designed for one purpose: to destroy the Mitsubishi A-6M Zero. After a nearly intact Zero was recovered in the Aleutian Islands in 1942, American engineers flight-tested it and fed every weakness they found into the Hellcat's ongoing development. It had a 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine that gave it a 30-mile-per-hour speed advantage over the Zero at every altitude. It carried 650 caliber machine guns with 400 rounds per gun. It had 212 pounds of armor plate protecting the pilot. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb hits without exploding. The Zero had no pilot armor. The Zero had no self-sealing tanks. Those were deliberate design choices Japan had made to save weight and maximize range and maneuverability, and in 1941, against slower American fighters flown by less experienced pilots, they had been the right choices. By 1944, they were death sentences. An American pilot could take hits, survive, and keep fighting. A Japanese pilot, who took a single 50 caliber round in his fuel tank, was on fire. Then there was the tactic. The Thach weave, invented by Lieutenant Commander John Thach on his kitchen table in Coronado, California, using matchsticks to simulate fighters. Two aircraft, or two pairs, would fly in crossing patterns. When a Zero locked onto one, the partner would turn in for a deflection shot. It negated the Zero's turning advantage by refusing to turn with it. Thach had tested it at Midway, where his small division shot down several Zeros, and by 1944, it was standard doctrine across the entire Navy. Then there was the system. The American carriers had something the Japanese carriers did not: a radar-directed fighter control network that could detect incoming raids at over 100 miles, calculate their altitude, bearing, and speed, and vector-defending Hellcats to intercept them at optimum position before they ever reached the fleet. The fighter direction officers sitting in darkened rooms below the flight decks of those carriers were, in a real sense, the most important men in the battle. They were the ones who told the Hellcat pilots where to go, when to climb, and when to attack. The Japanese had nothing comparable. And behind the fighters, as a final wall, stood Vice Admiral Willis Lee's battle line, Task Group 58.7. 7 fast battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, and 17 destroyers, arranged in a barrier formation, their anti-aircraft batteries loaded with a weapon the Japanese did not know existed. It was called the VT proximity fuse. A standard anti-aircraft shell had to either hit an aircraft directly or be set to detonate at a pre-calculated altitude by a timed fuse. The VT fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter. When the shell passed close to an aircraft, the reflected radio signal triggered detonation automatically. It did not need a direct hit. It did not need a perfect time setting. It simply needed to pass near the target. In 1943, although only about a quarter of American anti-aircraft ammunition carried these fuses, they accounted for roughly half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. They were approximately 300% more effective than conventional shells. The Japanese knew nothing about them. This was what was waiting on the morning of June 19, 1944, when the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared on American radar screens at 1000 hours. Behind the fighters and the fuses and the radar was something even more fundamental: American industrial production. The Essex-class aircraft carrier was the most produced fleet carrier in history. 24 were completed out of 32 ordered. 14 saw combat in the war. Not one was lost to enemy action, although several were severely damaged. Each carried roughly 90 to 100 aircraft. Grumman alone built over 12,000 Hellcats during the war. The 15 carriers of Task Force 58 carried approximately 900 aircraft between them. Japan had nothing close to this depth. Ozawa's 9 carriers carried roughly 430. Even if his pilots had been equal to the Americans in skill, he was outnumbered 2 to 1 in the air. The raid, 69 aircraft launched from Ozawa's light carriers, was detected at nearly 150 miles. Mitscher had time. He launched every Hellcat he had, he stacked them in layers, and then the first wave made a fatal mistake. At roughly 70 miles from the fleet, the Japanese formation paused. They circled to regroup, to tighten their formation, to make sure everyone was in position. It was textbook, it was disciplined, and it gave the American fighter direction officers exactly the time they needed to position over 30 Hellcats directly above the Japanese formation at superior altitude with the sun behind them. The interception was not a battle. It was an execution. The Hellcats came down out of the sun in slashing high-speed passes, exactly as their doctrine prescribed. Do not turn with the zero. Do not slow down. Dive, fire, pull up, climb, and dive again. The Japanese fighters, disoriented and outmatched, could not protect the bombers. 42 of the 69 aircraft in the first wave were destroyed by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The handful that made it through to the fleet achieved almost nothing. A single bomb struck the battleship South Dakota, killing 24 men and wounding 27 more, but causing no significant structural damage. Not one aircraft from the first wave reached an American carrier. Not one. Commander Charles Brewer, leading the fighters of VF-15 off the carrier Essex, personally shot down 3 Japanese aircraft in the interception of this raid. He was an aggressive, skilled pilot, an ace with 6.5 victories. Later that same day, Brewer was killed during a strafing run over Orote Field on Guam. He was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously. The second wave was even larger and even more doomed. Between 109 and 128 aircraft, including Judy dive bombers and Jill torpedo bombers, launched from Ozawa's main carrier divisions. This wave had the worst luck of any Japanese formation that day. As it flew toward the American fleet, it passed directly over the Japanese vanguard force, Admiral Kurita's surface ships. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners on those ships, undertrained and on edge, opened fire on their own aircraft. 2 planes were shot down. 8 more were damaged so badly they had to turn back. The wave had not yet seen an American, and it had already lost 10 aircraft to its own guns. When the survivors were detected on American radar at 11:07 at a range of 115 miles, the Hellcats were ready. They intercepted at roughly 60 miles from the fleet. Approximately 70 of the attackers were shot down before they ever reached the ships. A few torpedo bombers broke through. One hit the battleship Indiana at the waterline, but its torpedo failed to detonate. Some Judy dive bombers made runs on the carriers Wasp and Bunker Hill, but scored no hits. Of the roughly 100 aircraft that had crossed the Japanese vanguard without being shot down by their own side, 97 were destroyed. This was the wave that produced the moment the battle is most remembered for. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu was flying an F-6F Hellcat off the Lexington with Fighter Squadron 16. His engine was stuck in low supercharger, limiting his performance, but it did not matter. He intercepted a formation of Judy dive bombers roughly 25 miles west of the carrier. In approximately 8 minutes, Vraciu shot down 6 of them. He used 360 rounds of ammunition. Each kill took less than 5 seconds of firing. He chased the last one down into his own fleet's anti-aircraft fire. When he landed aboard Lexington, he held up 6 gloved fingers for the camera in what became one of the most iconic photographs of the Pacific War. He had been the wingman of Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first ace of the war. He was the son of Romanian immigrants from East Chicago, Indiana. He would finish the war as the Navy's 4th-ranking ace, with 19 confirmed aerial victories. The 3rd Japanese wave, 47 aircraft launched from the 2nd Carrier Division, fared somewhat better, not because it fought well, but because it mostly failed to find the American fleet. 40 of the aircraft turned back without pressing their attacks. Only 7 were shot down. The 4th wave was the final catastrophe. 82 aircraft from multiple divisions were launched with garbled coordinates. They searched in the wrong direction, found nothing, and split up. One group stumbled into American fighters and lost half its planes. Another group of 9 dive bombers found the carriers Wasp and Bunker Hill, attacked without scoring any hits, and lost 8 of the 9. The largest group, roughly 49 aircraft, headed for Guam to refuel. As they approached Orote Field with their landing gear already lowered, 27 Hellcats from 3 different American carriers fell on them. The Japanese aircraft, slowed for landing and unable to maneuver, were destroyed almost without resistance. 30 of the 49 were shot down. The remaining 19 were so badly damaged when they hit the cratered runway that none ever flew again. Across the day's engagements, Commander David McCampbell, the air group commander from Essex, had led his fighters of VF-15 into multiple interceptions. McCampbell himself shot down 5 Judy dive bombers and 2 Zeros over the course of the day, becoming an ace in a single engagement. He was a 1933 Annapolis graduate who had survived the sinking of the carrier Wasp off Guadalcanal in 1942. He would finish the war as the Navy's all-time leading ace, with 34 confirmed victories, including a record 9 in a single mission at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, 4 months later. He received the Medal of Honor. By sunset on June 19th, by one American tally published in 1945, the Japanese Navy had lost not fewer than 358 carrier and land-based aircraft in a single day. American air-to-air losses were fewer than 24 Hellcats. The most lethal pilot corps that had ever operated from aircraft carrier decks had been effectively annihilated in roughly 8 hours. And Ozawa, sitting aboard his flagship, did not know it. Because while the air battle was being lost above, Ozawa was losing something even more critical below the waves. At 8:10 that morning, just as his carriers were launching aircraft for the massive second raid, the American submarine Albacore, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, and had maneuvered into firing position against Ozawa's flagship, the carrier Taiho. Taiho was the newest and most advanced carrier in the Japanese fleet, commissioned only 3 months earlier. She had an armored flight deck, the first Japanese carrier built with one. She was supposed to be nearly unsinkable. Blanchard fired 6 torpedoes. His torpedo data computer was feeding him bad data, so he fired by instinct. 5 missed, but a Japanese pilot named Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, who had just taken off from Taiho, saw one of the torpedo tracks heading for his ship. Komatsu deliberately dove his aircraft into the path of the torpedo, detonating it short of the hull in an act of self-sacrifice that was, by any measure, extraordinarily brave. But one torpedo still struck. It hit Taiho's starboard side, rupturing 2 aviation fuel storage tanks. The damage seemed survivable. The ship's speed dropped by only 1 knot. But the fuel in those ruptured tanks was not standard refined aviation gasoline. It was unrefined crude oil from Borneo, volatile and unpredictable, because American submarines had sunk so many Japanese tankers that the fleet could no longer transport refined fuel from the southern oil fields back to Japan. They were burning raw crude straight from the wells, and now that crude was leaking into the lower compartments of the ship. An inexperienced damage control officer made a decision that doomed the Taiho. He ordered the ventilation system turned to full power to clear the gasoline fumes from the damaged area. Instead of venting the fumes out, the system spread them throughout the ship. By mid-afternoon, the entire lower hull of Taiho was saturated with explosive vapor. A spark from an electrical generator found the vapor. The explosion lifted the armored flight deck and blew the hull open. Taiho, the unsinkable carrier, sank in minutes. Roughly 1,650 of her 2,100 crew went down with her. Ozawa, who wanted to go down with his ship, was physically restrained by his staff and transferred first to the destroyer Wakatsuki, whose cramped radio room could barely handle fleet communications, and then eventually to the heavy cruiser Haguro to try to regain command of his shattered force. 3 hours earlier, another American submarine had struck. The Kavala, on her first war patrol under Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, had been tracking the Japanese fleet since June 17th. At 11:18, Kossler found himself 1,200 yards from the carrier Shokaku, one of the 2 surviving carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Shokaku was recovering aircraft, turning into the wind, unable to maneuver. Kossler fired 6 torpedoes set to run at 15 feet. 3 hit. Shokaku, loaded with fuel and armed aircraft, burned and then exploded. She sank with heavy loss of life. Kavala survived a counterattack of 106 depth charges. By the end of June 19th, Ozawa had lost 2 of his 3 largest carriers and the vast majority of his air groups. Of the approximately 430 carrier aircraft he had launched that morning, only about 35 remained operational. But he did not know this. His surviving pilots, following a pattern of inflated reporting that had plagued the Japanese military throughout the war, had radioed back claims of massive damage to the American fleet. Ozawa believed he was winning. He planned to attack again the next day. The next day, June 20th, belonged to Mitscher. The morning was spent searching for Ozawa's retreating fleet, which was steaming west to refuel. Late in the afternoon, at roughly 3:40, an Enterprise search plane finally confirmed contact. The Japanese fleet was 275 miles away, steaming west at 20 knots. This was at the extreme limit of American strike range. By the time the planes reached the target, fought, and returned, it would be dark. Many of the planes would run out of fuel before they made it back. Mitscher knew all of this. He turned to his staff and said 2 words: launch them. 216 aircraft, 85 Hellcats, 54 Avenger torpedo bombers, 51 Helldiver dive bombers, and 26 Dauntless dive bombers roared off the flight decks into the late afternoon sky. Then came worse news. A corrected position report placed the Japanese fleet another 60 miles farther away than originally calculated. The pilots, already in the air, did the math in their heads. Many of them knew they did not have the fuel to return. They pressed the attack anyway. In the fading light, the American strike found Ozawa's fleet and struck. Avenger torpedo bombers from the light carrier Belleau Wood, led by Lieutenant Junior Grade George Brown, attacked the carrier Hio. Brown flew straight down the flight deck, drawing anti-aircraft fire to himself so that his wingman could get into position and put a torpedo into Hio's hull. The torpedo hit. Hio sank. The 3rd Japanese carrier lost in 2 days. George Brown did not make it home. His plane was lost on the return flight, either to anti-aircraft fire or fuel exhaustion. The American strike also damaged the carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda, the battleship Haruna, and 2 fleet oilers that were so badly hit they had to be scuttled by their own escorts. The Japanese could put up only about 35 aircraft in defense. American losses in the attack itself were roughly 20 planes. Then came the flight home and the crisis that would define Mitscher as a commander. 200 aircraft, low on fuel, many damaged, were trying to find their carriers in total darkness. American fleet doctrine required all ships to operate fully darkened at night to prevent submarine attack. The returning pilots could not see the fleet. They were ditching into the ocean one by one as their fuel ran out. Mitscher made a decision that every man in the fleet understood could cost ships and lives. He ordered the fleet illuminated. Searchlights pointed straight up into the sky. Truck lights on the flight decks blazed. Star shells arced overhead. Destroyers turned on their running lights and aimed spotlights at the carriers to guide pilots in. The fleet lit up like a city in the middle of the Pacific, visible to any Japanese submarine for 50 miles in every direction. It was an act of calculated recklessness to save his pilots. One officer aboard the light carrier Cabot described the scene. He said that the men on deck stood with their mouths open at the audacity of inviting the enemy to come and find them. He said their pilots were not expendable. The illumination worked, but not perfectly. Some pilots, confused by the lights, tried to land on cruisers and destroyers. Others crashed on deck. Roughly 80 aircraft were lost that night, about 18 in deck crashes, and the rest to fuel exhaustion and ditching. But the human cost was far less than it might have been. Over the following days, a massive air and sea rescue operation recovered 143 of the 185 airmen who had gone into the water. Somewhere between 40 and 50 men were lost, far fewer than the aircraft. When it was over, Mitscher's assessment was blunt. The enemy had escaped. He had been badly hurt by one aggressive carrier airstrike at the one time he was within range. His fleet was not sunk. Mitscher wanted to pursue. Spruance, cautious and focused on protecting the Saipan invasion fleet, would not allow it. The decision remains one of the most debated in American naval history. But the question of whether the Japanese fleet escaped is, in the larger story, almost irrelevant. The Japanese fleet did escape. The Japanese naval air arm did not. What had been destroyed on June 19th and 20th was not a collection of aircraft. Aircraft can be replaced. What had been destroyed was the last generation of carrier-trained pilots the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever produce. In the post-war interrogations conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Japanese officers were asked bluntly what had caused the collapse of their air power. Their answers were consistent and remarkably candid. They pointed to three things: failure of production, failure of transportation, meaning fuel, and lack of pilots. Not lack of planes, lack of pilots. When asked whether Japanese air forces had improved during the war, the answer that emerged was devastating in its simplicity. The pilots got worse, but the planes got better. Captain Omei, the operations officer for Admiral Kurita's force, was even more direct about the broader strategic situation. He said it was the last chance they had, although not a very good one. There was no bravado in these interrogation transcripts. There was no defiance. There was only the quiet acknowledgement of men who understood, now that the war was over, that the system they had served had consumed the thing it needed most. The proof of that consumption came 4 months later, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Ozawa was given command of a force built around the carrier Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, and 3 light carriers, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. The force also included the hybrid battleship carriers Ise and Hyuga, which were designed to carry aircraft but sailed with no planes aboard at all. Across his entire force, Ozawa had roughly 108 aircraft, not because he lacked carriers, because he lacked pilots to fly from them. His mission was not to fight. His mission was to die in the right place. Ozawa's carriers were a decoy. They were ordered to sail south and make themselves as visible as possible to lure Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet north, away from the landing beaches at Leyte Gulf, so that Japanese surface forces under Kurita could break through and destroy the American invasion fleet. Historians would later describe the mission as wholly one of sacrifice. Ozawa himself said after the war that he had not much confidence in the plan, but there was no other way than to try. The decoy worked. Halsey took the bait. He steamed north with his entire fast carrier force and attacked Ozawa's fleet off Cape Engano on October 25, 1944. All 4 of Ozawa's carriers were sunk. Zuikaku, the last ship that had launched planes against Pearl Harbor, rolled over and went down with her battle flag still flying. The name Cape Engano is Spanish. It means deception. The carriers were sacrificed because they were empty. They were empty because the men who were supposed to fly from them had been destroyed over the Philippine Sea 4 months earlier, or over Rabaul the year before that, or over Guadalcanal the year before that, or at Midway 2 years before that. Each battle had consumed a generation, and no new generation had been grown to replace them, because the system had never been designed to replace them. It had been designed to perfect them, to use them once in a single decisive battle, and then the war would be over. The war was not over. And so Japan turned to the final consequence of the Philippine Sea. With no trained pilots left, with no training pipeline capable of producing them, with fuel supplies strangled by American submarines, the Imperial Japanese Navy made a decision that has haunted military ethics ever since. If the pilots could not hit their targets in a conventional attack, they would become the weapon. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi formed the Special Attack Units in the Philippines in October 1944. On October 25, the same day Ozawa's empty carriers were being sunk off Cape Engano, the first organized kamikaze attacks struck American ships off Leyte, sinking the escort carrier St. Lo. Sakai, the ace who had seen the collapse coming, understood the logic with terrible clarity. He would later explain that when you are sending a pilot with only a handful of flight hours against Hellcats and Corsairs, he is going to die anyway. If he is going to die anyway, a deliberate crash into an enemy ship will probably cause more damage than an attack he is not skilled enough to execute. The kamikaze was not born from fanaticism alone, it was born from arithmetic. The arithmetic of a training system that had consumed its own masters, a fuel supply that could not sustain its own students, and a doctrine that had promised one decisive battle and then kept demanding more battles from men who had fewer and fewer hours in the cockpit each time. The Turkey Shoot was the breaking point. Everything that came after, the empty carriers at Leyte, the kamikazes off Okinawa, the desperate final sortie of the super battleship Yamato herself, all of it flowed from the 2 days in June, when the last trained generation was fed into a defense system they had no chance of penetrating. The strategic consequences went beyond the destruction of Japanese air power. The American seizure of the Marianas, which the Philippine Sea made possible by neutralizing the Japanese fleet, put the Japanese home islands within range of the new B-29 Superfortress heavy bomber for the first time. Airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam would soon be launching the massive strategic bombing campaign that burned Japan's industrial cities one by one. The atomic bomb that ended the war would be loaded aboard the Enola Gay at North Field on Tinian, one of the very islands the battle had been fought to capture. Within a month, after the fall of Saipan on July 9th, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and his entire cabinet were forced to resign on July 18th. The men in Tokyo understood what the battle meant, even if they could not admit it publicly. The decisive battle had been fought. Japan had lost. And that defense system was itself a story of adaptation. The Americans who built the Hellcat, who invented the Thatch Weave, who developed radar fighter direction, who deployed the VT proximity fuse, who designed the layered defense that shredded 4 Japanese waves in a single day, they had not been the better force in 1942. At Midway, the American torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadron 8 launched 15 Devastators against the Japanese fleet. Every single aircraft was shot down. 29 of the 30 aircrew were killed without scoring a single hit. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water and watching the battle from the ocean's surface. In the skies over Guadalcanal, American pilots flying the inferior Wildcat had survived mainly through courage, the Thatch Weave, and the fact that the Japanese were flying at extreme range. The Americans had learned. They had studied the Zero and built a plane to beat it. They had studied their own losses and created tactics to prevent them. They had studied the problem of fleet air defense and engineered a solution so comprehensive that by June 1944, it was virtually impenetrable. The Japanese had also learned Ozawa's operational plan was sophisticated. His use of outranging, the strategy of striking from beyond American range, was tactically sound. His shuttle bombing concept was creative, but all of it depended on one thing the Japanese no longer had: pilots who could execute it. The plan was excellent. The men who had to fly it could barely land on a carrier, let alone hit a ship defended by the most advanced fighter and anti-aircraft system in the world. The verdict on the Philippine Sea is not that the Americans were better. In 1941, man for man, the Japanese naval aviators were almost certainly the most skilled carrier pilots alive. The verdict is that the American system was better. It was better because it treated its best people as seed corn rather than ammunition. It rotated its veterans home to multiply their knowledge through training instead of spending them in combat until they were gone. It scaled its production to match its losses. It adapted its technology to match the threat. And it did all of this while the Japanese system, locked into a doctrine that demanded perfection over quantity and a single decisive battle over sustained attrition, did the opposite. Ozawa understood this. He had commanded the most powerful carrier force Japan could assemble, and he had watched it evaporate in a single day. The doctrine had promised him victory. The system behind the doctrine had sent him men who could not deliver it. He would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life. On the morning of June 19, 1944, roughly 430 Japanese aircrew climbed into their cockpits on 9 carriers west of the Marianas. They had been told this was the decisive battle. Many of them believed it. Some of them may have known, in the way a man knows something he will not say, that they were not ready, that they had not had enough hours, that the aircraft they were flying against were faster, tougher, and flown by men who had been trained by veterans they would never meet. They went anyway. Most of them did not come back. They were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were men who had been produced by a system that had promised to make them invincible and had instead made them disposable. They had been told they were the heirs of the pilots who struck Pearl Harbor, and in name they were. In training, in hours, in the hard, relentless accumulation of skill that turns a student into a fighter pilot, they were not. They were the gap between what a doctrine promised and what a nation could deliver. And they paid for that gap with their lives over the Philippine Sea on a clear June morning, while their commanders watched the radar screens and counted the planes that did not return. The man who named it a turkey shoot did not mean it as cruelty. He meant it as a description. But inside that description is something that should not be forgotten. A turkey shoot requires a target. The targets were young men, many of them teenagers, sitting in cockpits they had barely learned to fly, heading toward a wall of fire they had never been trained to survive, sent by a doctrine that had consumed the men who were supposed to teach them how to live through it. The tragedy of the Philippine Sea is not that the Japanese lost. It is that many of the men who died that day had been sentenced by their own system long before they ever took off. The training that was not provided, the fuel that was not available, the veterans who were not sent home to teach, the pipeline that was never built, those were the weapons that killed them. The Hellcats and the VT fuses were just the instruments that delivered the verdict. If this investigation gave you something worth thinking about, hit that like button. Not for the algorithm. For the men on both sides of that ocean who climbed into cockpits knowing what they were being asked to do, and did it anyway. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many more of these stories, and in every one of them, the thing that decided the outcome was not the battle you can see, it was the decision made years before, in a training school, or a planning room, or a shipyard, by men whose names never made the history books, whose choices built the system that either saved or failed the men who had to fight inside it. The pilots who died over the Philippine Sea deserve to be remembered not as targets in a turkey shoot, but as the final evidence of what happens when a nation builds a military philosophy around perfection and then discovers that perfection cannot be replaced.